If you've ever installed Windows Server, you'll have been presented with two options. There's the one that used to be called Server Core, and there's the one that's now called the Desktop Experience. Now, most people go ahead and hit the second option, because who wants Windows without the actual Windows, right? Well, you might want to give it some thought. Welcome back to the Pro Tech Show, the place for tech tips and advice for IT pros and decision makers. Alright then, what is Windows Server Core and why might you want to use it? Windows Server Core is Windows Server without the graphical user interface. When you log on, you get a command prompt and nothing else. Now, for a lot of Windows admins, that could be a shock, but for a large proportion of the world's servers, that's completely normal. Yes, Linux admins, you have every right to chuckle because you were doing command line only before it was cool. Microsoft obviously agree there's merit to the approach because they are now pushing Server Core as the default and recommended installation type for Windows Server. But why? Why would a Windows admin want to reverse decades of progress and go back to DOS? Well, firstly, it's not DOS. And secondly, there are some real advantages. The primary reason for Windows Server Core's existence is security. When it was first released, Microsoft calculated that in the previous 5 years, 70% of the security vulnerabilities that were discovered would not have affected Windows Server Core. By stripping away all of the graphical components that aren't strictly necessary for the running of the server, you drastically reduce its attack surface. Consider this example. There have been many security vulnerabilities discovered over the years in web browsers, a lot of which can be triggered just by visiting a compromised website. You load the web page, your browser loads malicious code, and now your computer's compromised. Now, if that happens on a server, the results can be pretty dire. But you shouldn't really be browsing the internet on a server anyway. It's not there to do your online shopping or to check up on Facebook. Solution? Remove the web browser. You didn't actually need it in the first place, and now it can't be exploited. Windows Server Core takes that same logic and extends it to every non-essential graphical component on the server. Now let's face it, on a server, most graphical components are non-essential. At most you use them to administer the server occasionally, but most of the time the server just sits there chugging away by itself without any display even attached to it. Which is kinda wasteful really. A graphical interface consumes resources. It eats memory, it uses CPU cycles, it takes up disk space. 99% of the time you're not getting any benefit from it, but it's costing you money just by being there. If you can remove those graphical components, you free up resources for more important tasks. Now in theory that can lead to better performance, but these days you might see more benefit from being able to reduce the size of your server instead. With virtualization technology, a smaller per server footprint allows you to run more servers on fewer hosts, potentially saving you money on hardware. The cost saving is even more apparent in the cloud, where you're billed for resources used over time. If you can reduce the size of your servers by going core, it can make a lot of sense. Otherwise, you're just paying for a bigger server in order to host a graphical interface that most of the time you're not even using. By the way, if you find this sort of content useful, then give it a like and don't forget to subscribe for future videos. Now let's talk about updates. A benefit that's often claimed of Windows Server Core is reduced maintenance. Now when it first came out, that was definitely true. That was back in the day when Windows updates were delivered as a whole pile of individual updates. Windows Server Core didn't have the graphical components, so there was less to patch. That meant each month you got fewer updates, and in some months you didn't get any, and that was great. These days it doesn't really hold true so much, because these days Windows updates are delivered as one big cumulative update, and you have to install that one big update regardless of how many components you're actually using that got patched. That really negated a lot of the benefit of going Windows Server Core for reduced maintenance. The benefits these days are definitely around security, followed by cost and then performance. But hold on, this is Windows, not Linux. Wouldn't removing the graphical components cripple functionality? Well, in the early days, yeah. When Server Core first came out with Windows Server 2008, it didn't include the likes of .NET or PowerShell, which seriously limited what you could do with it. It's worth mentioning that in those early days, Server Core wasn't the recommended installation option as it is now. The inclusion of PowerShell in particular has made Server Core a lot more practical. If you haven't noticed, a lot of Microsoft's applications these days are preferring the use of PowerShell over their graphical tools. By that I mean the graphical tools can only configure a subset of options compared to PowerShell. you spend enough time in Skype, Exchange or System Center for example, then at some point you're gonna have to break out the command line. In a world where the command line is more powerful than the graphical tools, Server Core makes a lot of sense. PowerShell has made Server Core a lot easier to administer directly, but this is Windows, and Windows has always been about the graphical tools. That hasn't changed, you just run them on your workstation instead of the server. Let me show you. I've put together a quick lab for this with two servers. On the left we have Windows Server with the desktop experience, and on the right we have Windows Server Core. To show you how you can manage each of them, I'm going to install the DNS server role and create a DNS record. Let's start with the desktop experience. From Server Manager, I'm going to add the DNS role and click my way through the wizard. This shouldn't take too long, but I'll skip to the end to save time. Alright, here we are. You can see the server has the DNS role installed now, and I can open the DNS Manager to administer it. Let's quickly add a DNS zone. And then we can add a record as well. There we go, nice and easy. Now let's see how we do the same with Server Core. As you can see, all you get here is the command line. If I want to administer this server directly, I can do so here. I can switch to PowerShell and install a DNS server role like so. That's not particularly difficult, but managing the records can be a bit of a pain, so I'm not going to do this. I'm going to log off and go back to my desktop server. Now I'm back in Server Manager and I'm going to go to All Servers and add my core server. Once it refreshes, I'm able to manage both servers from the same place. Once I've done that, I can basically repeat the process from before. The only thing I need to do differently is remember to select my core server from the list. Then it's the same wizard to install the DNS server role. We've skipped the end again and you can see both servers now showing as having the DNS role installed. In the same way I can open DNS Manager to administer my desktop server, I can do exactly the same thing to manage my core server. Let's add a zone to this one too. And a DNS record as well. The process is exactly the same, I'm just running the management tools on a different machine. As you can see, the sort of tasks you typically do in a graphical interface can still be done in a graphical interface, you just don't log onto the server to do it. In a lot of ways, Server Core enforces good practice. And let's face it, logging onto a server to click buttons was never really best practice in the first place, and it leads to people using the server like their own personal desktop. Those of you who've worked with me will know how much I hate logging onto the server and finding like 3 new web browsers installed. I don't care if you prefer Chrome and you prefer Firefox, this is the server, not your own personal playground. I can't count the number of times I've heard of a critical system going down, and the root cause was some admin who'd left the session open with lots of unnecessary tools that had slowly gobbled up the server's memory. Honestly, one of the most underrated advantages of Server Core is that it nips that kind of behaviour right in the bud. I mean, I've suggested adding electrodes to mice and shocking people who don't log off, but apparently that might lose us some customers. From what I've seen, this tends to be more of a problem in smaller environments, and when you get to really large environments, then you're frankly not going to have time to keep logging on to individual servers anyway. With that skill, you've probably invested in automation, and what does automation use? It uses command line and APIs, not a graphical interface. So at that scale, why waste the resources in one? It's not all sunshine and roses though. There are a number of applications that simply won't run on Windows Server Core because they assume the existence of certain files or the ability to run a local management console. Now Microsoft suggests you should challenge such backward vendors to update their apps. Which is ironic, because Microsoft are one of the biggest offenders. Even today, a number of their flagship products still won't run on Windows Server Core. Now there is a sort of middle ground where you can install a limited set of graphical apps but not the full graphical interface, but you should talk to individual vendors to make sure you're not invalidating your support. Another thing you may need to consider is remote support, particularly if you've outsourced to a third party. Now I've shown you how managing Server Core can be virtually the same as managing the desktop version, but that is when I was on the same domain and network. If you've outsourced to a third party, chances are they're not on your network or your domain. In fact, the only access they might have to the server Could be via some kind of remote desktop connection. Now if that's the case, then maintaining a certain number of junk boxes for the third party to log into and use could be a good compromise. Now if they know what they're doing, then this shouldn't be a deal breaker and they should be able to resolve any issues from the command line anyway. But let's be sensible for a minute. Most Windows admins are more familiar with the graphical tools than the command line, and if you don't know exactly what you're looking for, then reading back Windows event logs from the command line give you a pretty horrible experience. Whether they can support it this way isn't really the point. If you've got an outage, you want your support people working as quickly as possible, not fighting against the lack of tools. So an element of pragmatism here can be sensible. So, should you go Windows Server Core? Well, let me flip that around for a minute and ask, why wouldn't you go Server Core? There are genuine reasons. If you have software compatibility issues, remote support challenges, or skills gaps, then those are real issues that might prevent you going Server Core. But if they don't apply, then Server Core is more secure than the desktop experience. And that is a pretty compelling reason to consider it. Something else you might want to consider is clicking on one of these videos over here. Let's face it, if you're still watching, I mustn't have done a terrible job, and you might enjoy one of these as well. If you found this video useful, then give it a thumbs up before you go, and don't forget to subscribe for future videos. Thanks for watching guys, see you next time.